All right. Welcome everybody. It's Thursday again. Time for our virtual small grains for brewing and distilling happy hour. This week I would like to toast fall harvest. It's a beautiful, breezy, sunny day. The leaves are changing. It's a great day to harvest field crops. So cheers to that. Toast or cheers. All right, so we have some video content with Brook giving us a walk through the rye variety trials at Kellogg Biological Station. And afterwards, he'll be giving us a talk about rye quality and the results of that. And then we'll hear from Richard Anderson from Ironfish Distilling about using local grains and crafting artisan spirits. So Brook, if you want to take it away.
Hi, I'm Brook Wilke. I'm at the Kellogg Biological Station out in our cereal rye variety trial, which is funded by the Michigan Craft Beverage Council. And we're nearing harvest here in our plot in southern Michigan. This plot is replicated at 3 sites across the state, so we can evaluate these varieties in the variety of Michigan climates. And we have 15 varieties out here where we're evaluating for agronomic quality and also grain quality, particularly focusing on how they would perform in a distillery and also in malt houses and breweries as well. And to add another layer to this project, we have 2 different management practices. One of which where we're applying growth regulators, which should help keep the rye shorter, and also fungicides, which would help protect the varieties from things that would, diseases that would affect the leaves and the grain quality. And so you can see that it's tall, it tends to fall over. Rye is known for that. And so managing it so that a farmer can grow it and harvest it well is really important so that they can deliver high quality seed. And you can also see that the varieties differ quite a bit in how tall they are and how they look at this stage. I want to point out a couple of different varieties that would be of interest and to highlight some of the differences that we have. So to the right here, we have a variety called Danko. It is a variety that was released in Poland in the 70s, and you can see it's standing really well. Right now it's about neck height on me, and it's all standing up real tall. It's going to be fairly easy to harvest. Danko is known for its winter hardiness and moderate to decent grain quality and yield characteristics. This is the first time we've grown it here, but I'm really impressed with how it looks at this point in its growth cycle. It's going to be harvestable. On my left is a variety called Merced. It's fairly typical of a lot of rye varieties, where as they mature, they tend to fall over because they're so tall and they just can't support themselves anymore. This particular variety will still be able to harvest, but it's not going to be as easy, and we'll see. It's just we might lose some during the harvest process, and it's going to be more challenging for the harvest machine. So here I'm next to a hybrid rye variety called KWS Braceto, and for 10 to 15 years KWS company in particular has been breeding hybrid ryes, and the growth habit is quite a bit different than the open pollinated ryes. They tend to be shorter, and in most studies they yield quite a bit more. So there's more kernels, and they're pretty big kernels as well. And so you can see this variety here, it kind of looks similar to that Danko we looked at, but we suspect that it'll be higher yielding and really good quality as well. Now, if you're thinking about growing hybrid rye, you should know that you should expect to pay more for seed because there's more into the breeding process. And you also cannot save the seed for replanting because the genetics that will grow from the seeds that are produced from this variety won't grow back pure. They'll grow back with a wide range of genetics because of that hybridization that occurs during the breeding process. I also wanted to mention, as you can see kind of the diversity of rye in the background, that rye is one of the only cereal grains that we grow that is wind pollinated, which means that when we have a field like this with a bunch of varieties side by side, we can't expect to maintain genetic purity in any of these because there's going to be pollen floating around all over the place. And it's part of the difficulty in maintaining genetic purity of rye of any variety. You need to have significant isolation from other rye varieties to maintain that purity. And breeders and seed producers have learned that over time, that they have to be super vigilant about maintaining that distance to keep the varieties. And it also has led to some challenges in maintaining commercial diversity of varieties. We just don't have as many available varieties as we do in wheat and barley and other crops. Now I'm going to walk back here a little bit and talk about a different variety. It's one that, oh, hold on, I'll walk through here and you hear the cracking of the stems. So behind me here, there's one that's standing, and it's really tall. And this one is actually a native Michigan variety. It was released by Michigan State back in the 70s, and it's called Wheeler. And it is produced and sold locally, and it's primarily marketed as a cover crop or forage rye, and you can see it's still standing really tall right now. There's some stems that still have some green in it. It seems to be the latest maturing of all the varieties that we have in this plot. We know that we're not going to get a great seed yield from it. That's not what it was bred for, but it does produce decent quality seed, and we know that distillers and brewers have used Wheeler rye in their craft beverage production in the past, and it tends to do a good job. Farmers should just not expect to get that much of it. However, it can be a dual purpose. Maybe you think you might use it for a cover crop, or maybe you'll keep it for harvest, so it can be a good variety to grow for that purpose. So I wanted to mention a little bit, if you haven't grown rye before, just some things to keep in mind when you're growing rye. And I'm standing in front of our border plots here, which happens to be a variety called AC Hazlitt. It comes from Canada. It's really winter hardy and a good dual purpose variety that can be used for grain, forage, or a cover crop. And a couple things to consider in general, you know, when growing a typical variety is that it gets really tall. And managing that can be a challenge. We've discussed to keep it upright and harvest, but you should also know that it's going to be slow and difficult to combine and harvest for seed because there's a lot of material that needs to go through the combine in order to get the seed threshed. On the backside, the straw does have value from rye, so it seems like there should be a lot of straw, and there usually is quite a bit, but there's not as many stems per acre as a crop like wheat or barley, and so the overall yield isn't that much more for straw, but it does make really good straw, especially if you're looking for something with a long stem. Now that height also gives us an advantage as a cover crop, which is something that rye is used for very commonly in Michigan, and it's also very winter hardy, so that gives us two very reliable characteristics that we want. It's also fairly easy to kill before the next crop. But something that's being used more and more in agronomic circles is using rye as a cover crop and waiting till it gets, you know, waist high or so and starts flowering. And then it's either rolled down or it's planted right into, and then you have all of this residue that helps act as a mulch layer between the crop rows and holds down weeds and can help retain moisture too once it's dead. And so part of what we're evaluating with this study is looking at these different varieties, thinking about how they would perform in a setting where we just want a cover crop, or maybe we want a forage crop before our next cash crop. And you can see how looking at the diversity, we could use that diversity to our advantage depending on how we want to integrate these varieties into our systems.
Hi, Ryan here again. This time I'm in the rye trial plot. I'd like to relate my experiences with rye in the malt house. In my time doing quality assurance assessments for incoming grain in the malt house, I handled a lot of barley and a lot of wheat. And my first test that I would do, which was make or break for the incoming load, was DON, deoxynivalenol, so the chief mycotoxin that we're testing for, produced by Fusarium head blight. And again, the threshold for acceptance was 1 part per million. If it was below a half part per million, even better, and that was preferred. Well, the highest DON concentration in any grain that I personally tested was actually rye. So I tested a sample that was 8 ppm, one that was a little bit below in the 7s. So that's excessively high, and I can't really speak. I don't remember, and I don't even know if it was discussed or not, whether it was sprayed with fungicide when it was in the field, or if it was, what the conditions were surrounding that application and how it was applied. But even in barleys that have come through my hands that may or may not have been treated with fungicide or were in less than optimal conditions, I never saw anything close to that as far as DON content. And from what I understand from research coming out of North Dakota State, with rye in the malting process, is that it is very prone to promote the growth of Fusarium in the malting process as well. So if you're going to be malting rye, you have to be very mindful of temperature control, moisture control. In addition to rye just not playing nicely in the malt house and brew house, it's very prone to Fusarium growth. So it's something to be aware of in the malting process. For you maltsters out there, it's similar to malting wheat in the airflow issues that can occur, the heat issues that can occur during germination, but to a much higher level and much more prone to growing Fusarium in the malt house versus wheat, which is much more prone to growing like bread mold kind of things, like black fungus. Steeping regimes in the malt house with rye, I would tend to go on the alkaline side of things, so boosting the pH of the steep water as high as possible. Actually kept biofoaming down in the steeping process, and kept gels from forming in the germination process, at least in my experience. So it made it a little bit easier to handle. If you're a farmer and you're growing rye and you're looking to sell it to a malt house, you don't really have to be as diligent about protein levels as you would with barley necessarily. Brewers and maltsters expect rye to be problematic, so as long as you keep those DON levels down and keep those seeds viable, so your germinative capacity, germinative energy, and just viability as seeds, as long as your germination is close to 100% as possible and DON levels are low, you should see good acceptance in the malt house.
Richard, can you give us some insights into your experience with sourcing local grain and how that translates into unique spirit character and spirit yield and everything?
Yeah, you bet. Well, thanks for having me. What's going on is super exciting, and I think it's really helpful for me because I'm chair of the research committee as the industry representative for the craft distillers in Michigan, and I chair the research committee of the Craft Beverage Council. And a few years ago, the legislature reframed that council to expand the research to include all of the beverage industry. And as you probably know, the craft beverage industry in Michigan is probably the youngest of the 3 sectors or the 4 sectors, with wine and cider and beer and now spirits. And this connection between farmers and distillers is really quite important because spirits are so grain intensive. It takes about, for us, it takes about 2.5 pounds of grain per bottle. And because we're growing Ironfish is, for those who don't know, Ironfish is a 120-acre farm. We have about 80 acres under cultivation. We're doing wheat and winter wheat and winter rye here. And we're doing everything naturally. So our yields are lower. We're hitting yields of 1,100 to 1,500 pounds per acre. We think about it in terms of pounds, which is kind of unusual. I think for farmer, we could do the math on the bushels, but for us, our mash, when we're mashing in rye, for example, we're using about 1,100 pounds per 500-gallon mash. And the yield on that, we call it kind of grain to whiskey yield, or grain to bottle yield, is about 400 bottles. So it's very grain intensive, and I think as the conversation between growers, researchers, and distillers emerge, I think Michigan has an opportunity to really differentiate itself and separate itself from other states in terms of the quality of spirits that are coming out and the care that's going into the selection of varieties that translate to taste profiles as well as yield and efficiency. And so it's quite helpful for me to be a part of it. A little bit about what we're doing here at Ironfish is that we're actually we're just learning. We're 4 years old. This was a 120-acre farm. It was for feedstock for dairy, and it was abandoned for 10 years. So it was a really nice opportunity to kind of head into the more natural direction. We are doing essentially a VNS or field rye here. And we've started playing around with other varieties like Hazlitt, and we're super excited to know that the trial included Hazlitt. What we're looking for in a rye grain is, and I'll talk a little bit about the characteristic of the grain, and then a little bit about how that translates to the glass. And I've actually brought something for my part of the cocktail program, and I'll introduce this to it in a second. That's actually available statewide. But we're really looking for berries that are plumper, obviously, because we'd like to actually have that yield a little higher. So that Danko, your work with Danko kind of interests us. We haven't planted Danko yet, but we understand that the berries are plumper. I've understood Danko to grow maybe a little shorter, but thicker stems. And obviously we're farmers as well as distillers, so we worry about lodging as well. And so we played around also with Hazlitt, which tends to have for us in our trial. I think it showed a lot of promise and was less susceptible to lodging. One of the characteristics that we're looking for in rye is, and it's really interesting, if you look at a Hazlitt, a whiskey made from Hazlitt rye, there's characteristics of sweetness that you might even find in a hybrid, in a kind of a bourbon, and so I think there's a market for Hazlitt. Because it has that sweetness, that characteristic that rye typically does not have. A lot of distillers call Hazlitt kind of a hybrid between rye and corn in terms of the flavor on the palate. Whereas the rye that we're growing in our field rye has a much, generally it's discussed or described as spice. But when you drill in, that spice tends to have an attitude around clove, cinnamon, allspice, ginger, nutmeg, and then what distillers are really looking for is how the natural tastes, which also I should mention, are also influenced by the yeast that's actually selected for fermentation. And that combination between how the yeasts are converting the sugars to ethanol and how that spirit tastes off the still, and then how it then combines with the tannins and the oak and the fiber and the toasted oak barrels gets you the final result. I was doing a little talking with our Chicago distributor, and interestingly, they said that in the last 2 years, they feel that rye is where bourbon drinkers are going. So as you know, bourbon is really quite popular, and that's kind of a recent phenomena. Bourbon as a 51% mash bill of corn or higher has more sweetness. Corn doesn't really. It doesn't do. I don't think it does as well long aged, and so bourbons can really come out quite nicely earlier, and I think that's primarily because of the corn profile. Whereas rye can actually tolerate and actually succeeds with longer aging, and that longer aging is sort of mellowing out the rye spice. I'm happy to talk about what we're doing here in terms of our practices. I know a little bit about that. The person on our team that actually does the farming would have more information, but I think I know enough to be dangerous. And then what I'd like to finally end with is introduce to everybody. So here's a little commercial. This is our first 21-month-old rye whiskey. This was rye grown in Free Soil, Manistee County, so it's not our rye. It's 95% rye, and we did 5% malt. You'll notice that the Arctic, here's another connection to MSU, because we've decided every whiskey should have a story, right? And this whiskey is bottled to benefit the return of Michigan's, the Arctic grayling to Michigan's rivers, and proceeds from the Arctic grayling whiskey release are actually supporting MSU's research to bring back the Arctic grayling to Michigan rivers. So there's something to cheers about, right? And
awesome, yeah.
So I'm going to show you a little bit about what we look for in a whiskey, and who knows if in Zoom you're going to be able to pick up on this. But that color, this is proof down to this probably went into the barrel at about 140 proof. So for those who don't know, 200 proof is pure alcohol. Vodka has to come off the still at 190 proof. This comes off at about 140 or so because we want more flavors. We want a lot more flavors to survive in the distilling process. And then it probably came out of the barrel 21 months later in the low 120s. And then we proofed this down to 96.2 proof with RO water. Ethanol is water soluble, and so adding water or adding RO water, and we use RO water because we already have influenced the flavor profile of this whiskey. We're using water from our own well. We're using local grain. We've picked the yeast. I'll talk a little bit about, if it makes sense, I'll talk a little bit about native or wild yeast in a minute. And then we love the flavor profile coming out of the barrel. So we use reverse osmosis water, and you'll notice essentially oils, or what a sommelier or taster would say is legs, and that it's viscosity or thickness, which actually does hold additional flavors in the spirit. And of course, the flavors have to taste good. Doesn't necessarily that legs mean it's a high quality whiskey. It just means it's holding a lot of flavor. So you're going to want to look for those characteristics in the glass. I'm holding up a Glencairn glass, which is designed to capture the nose of a spirit. And what you're really looking for in a whiskey, and especially this being a 95% rye whiskey, is you're wanting to see if the nose actually matches the palate and the flavor profile of the whiskey, and those should be somewhat synonymous or give you a hint of what's to come. So cheers, everybody. Thanks to MSU for all the work you guys are doing, and super excited to be a part of this conversation.
Yeah, cheers. Thank you.
Cheers.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Richard. Brooke, do we have time to present your data real quick?
Sure. Yeah, that was awesome, Richard. Thank you for those insights. Where can I get a bottle? Where do you have to go to get that grayling bottle? Is it all over the state, or do you have to go somewhere special to find a bottle?
No, any good liquor store can bring it in or already has it on their shelf. So if you just have them special order rye whiskey from Ironfish, that's what'll show up.
Awesome. I'll put it on my shopping list.
Thanks.
Excellent.
And then when you see Nicole on campus, who's doing the research, just let her know you're supporting the work.
Absolutely.
So I'm using a relatively new computer, and it appears that my settings aren't quite right to allow me to share the screen, which is okay. I can just tell you what I was going to say. First of all, our data for the variety trial are available on our malting barley site. I put that link in the chat box. You can go there, and we plan to update that site with the data as it goes along. But at first glance, there's about a 3-fold difference in yield between the varieties that we tested, starting with some of the cover crop varieties that I highlighted in the video at 30 to 40 bushels per acre, and the hybrids in excess of 100 bushels. And then we have a bunch of other data in terms of height and lodging scores and so forth that you can check out as well, that hopefully are valuable to growers and distillers in making recommendations. Second, I wanted to highlight, we're doing management work with the varieties as well to understand how to maybe improve the lodging and avoid fusarium contamination. And granted, it's just one site of our 3, but I have some interesting results that basically say that the hybrid varieties, the really high yielding ones, benefit from increased management like growth regulators and fungicides, but the open pollinated ones didn't really benefit from that extra management. They still lodged about the same grain yield. So I thought that was an interesting finding, and we'll be looking into that more with statistics and so forth. And then third, we do have batches of these varieties. You know, the plots that you saw in the video are small. We can't do a lot with that seed other than test basic grain quality and do some lab-based spirit yield and sensory analyses, which are valuable, and we're going to publish that. But we also have 7 varieties where we have larger quantities that Nicole Schreiner at MSU is going to take through her lab and evaluate, and we're planning on doing forgive my language, I don't know all the correct terms, but we're going to do a base mash and distillation. And then we're planning on also aging those and taking some quality analyses along the way. And then as those of you that are in the craft distilling world know, we're also looking for a distiller to take larger samples to 500 pounds of these varieties that we have left and do something fun with them and compare them, you know, through a real commercial scale. So that is all still in the works from the stuff that we did this year. And Dean and I are in the process of writing a proposal to extend this work and add some varieties and do another year with some more intensive evaluations. And so we're really excited about where this is going. And rye, I think, has a future both for distilling, but also for food and beer in addition. So that's my report.
Awesome. Thank you, Brooke. So I think we can open it up for questions. If anyone has any questions from the attendees. I think everyone's available to unmute if they want, or you can type it in the chat. All right. So it's not really a question, but it's interesting, the spicy character of rye. I have looked at it a bit from the context of brewing, and rye has usually that spicy character comes from ferulic acid in the rye, from what I understand. So these ferulic acids bind chains of hemicelluloses called the rabinoxylan together in the, I don't know, grain nerd stuff. But anyway, the ferulic acid is biotransformed by the yeast through fermentation into phenolic compounds, like chief of which is 4-vinyl glycol. And if you had a wheat beer, like a German Hefeweizen that has that clove character to it, that's 4-vinyl glycol, or 4VG for short. So if I'm not mistaken, that's kind of what you were talking about, Richard, that spice, clove, cinnamon character.
Yeah, that is. And, you know, we've been talking a lot about whiskey, but I want to draw your attention to the fact that I think craft distillers, you know, we're really super proud of what we've accomplished, but we know we're not the first. That rye in a vodka versus winter wheat in a vodka creates totally different vodkas, even at 190 proof coming off the still, if you do not charcoal filter your vodka. So like a Kettle One or a Absolute or a Svedka or all the world's or national Tito's, even though it's a potato vodka, if they charcoal filter it at the end of the distilling process, and for folks that don't know what charcoal filtering is, it's literally a fairly thick fiber membrane followed by charcoal membranes in successive order, and you actually pump the vodka through. And the whole idea of a charcoal filtered vodka is to eliminate all characteristics of the grain that produced it. And in the 1800s, that isn't how farms made vodka. And so you would know what region you're in by the aroma of your vodka. You would know you're in the wheat region or the rye region or the potato region. So we make a wheat and a winter wheat and a winter rye vodka, and it's super interesting to see how bartenders are treating rye vodkas and where they deploy them in cocktails, and how they're featuring them in martinis. And again, it's 2.5 pounds of rye per bottle, so it can consume a lot of rye if it becomes popular. And those characteristics will pop out in a vodka, albeit less prominent because of the proof being so much higher.
Yeah, I never really quite understood how to taste vodka and how to appreciate vodka based on how commercial vodkas, like big brand vodkas, are presented to us, because they are just, it's like neutral grain spirit. Like how am I supposed to know?
So I think like a Kettle One, which is celebrated as a world-class charcoal filtered vodka, what they're competing on is body, but absolutely no perceptible flavor, taste to the palate. So there's a lot of viscosity or body to it. And then in our this is on a bottle of vodka, what I think where the market is headed, just like where beer was 15 years ago. Beer didn't have the flavor profiles of beer, were pretty narrow 15 years ago, right? And now they're really quite expansive. Same with vodka. So if you find a vodka that is unfiltered and it says unfiltered on it, then a well-executed vodka will actually present the profiles of the grain that it's made from.
Yeah, it's something I haven't really done a lot of exploration on. I'm more of a whiskey guy, but yeah, now I know what to look for.
I think you're going to have to come up here for a research trial on martinis made from vodka.
Well, if you insist. Looks like we have a question in the chat from Tom, who's the founder of West Branch Malts in Ohio. He says they have 3 20-ton malting drums as well as a craft distillery on site, so they're kind of vertically integrated there, which is awesome. He's wondering, are there any craft beers using malted rye in their beers? And I can't think of any specific commercial examples local to me right now, but traditionally Roggen beer or German rye beer styles are made with malted rye, and rye box as well. I would guess that using flake dry in the mash of your beer in any significant quantities is going to be really problematic in the brew house, because it has a tendency to gel in the mash, and unlike distilling, you have to have relatively free-flowing wort coming off your mash. Otherwise, it's just a real long, terrible day for the brewer. Founders Red's Rye, when they used to market it as a regular offering, I believe used malted rye. But yeah, any traditionally styled Roggen beer, like I think Boulevard makes one called Rye Squared, in their smokestack series. But yeah, generally I don't see a whole lot of rye beers on the market, and I don't think it's for any other reason other than it's a real bear to work with in the brew house. Anybody else on the call have any perspectives on rye beers that might be readily available in the market using malted rye specifically? No? Yeah, they're still kind of rarity.
Similar question about whiskeys. Are there any spirits that are using malted rye, or is it mostly using barley malt or enzymes to get it started and then?
Yeah, there actually is. I think Whistle Pig, which is a farm distillery, is using mashes that are 50% malted rye and 50% rye from enzymes. And that's a characteristic that they're profiling in their whiskey. So there's absolutely an opportunity to strive for a particular flavor profile based on the blend of malt and regular rye.
Richard, you have some beautiful clouds in your background. Is that a picture or is that your real weather today?
That's our real weather today. That's our wedding venue back there.
And next week we have making malting grade is the topic of our session. So Christian Kapp should be joining us from MSU Upper Peninsula Research and Extension Center, UPREC, as we like to call it. And also Rebecca Jennings from Origin Malt, who is the technical director there, will be joining us, talking about malt quality and how grain gets accepted into the malt house there. And I'll be speaking from a craft malt perspective. And hopefully, if his Craft Maltsters Guild board meeting ends soon enough, Jeff Nopowicz will be joining from Great Lakes Malting Company. Even if it's a little late, I think he'll be on the call regardless. So, yeah, thank you for everyone for having a nice chat today. And yeah, it's been great.